People from more than 30 different countries have either partially or been completely barred from entry into the United States as of December 16th, 2025. The primary reason being national security concerns. However, I think this speech might actually reveal the real reason behind this expanded travel ban.
And I say, why is it we only take people from shithole countries, right? Why can't we have some people from Norway, Sweden, just a few? Let us have a few. From Denmark, do you mind sending us a few people? Send us some nice people, do you mind? But we always take people from Somalia, places that are a disaster, right? Filthy, dirty, disgusting, ridden with crime. The only thing they're good at is going after ships. But they don't go after our ships. You know why? Because that same missile that knocks the crap out of them, that with the drug dealers from Venezuela and others.
I find it quite curious the countries that he chose as good countries that people should come from and bad countries that people should not come from. Just a coincidence, I imagine. Tragically, this is just one event in a very, very long list of anti-immigrant events, bills, laws, which have been a part of the United States' history. I would love to tell you a short story from the past about how this kind of rhetoric and ideas can actually destroy communities. A story that happened in my own hometown, my own local community, and it's something that I didn't even know growing up. Today, we're going to be traveling back in time to the late 1800s to uncover the Chinese fishing village community that existed right here and how the first major anti-immigrant law that was passed in the US caused this village to go from a thriving, diverse community to being forgotten to the sands of time within the span of just one decade. All right, let's talk about China. And no, not the China we see today with the wild infrastructure and the vibrant economy, but more specifically, China during the 1800s. See, there's a phrase in Mandarin that goes something along the lines of 百年国耻, which translates to the century of humiliation. Now, China in the 1800s was not the same prosperous China that we see today. This century of humiliation is generally attributed to the time between the ending or beginning of the First Opium War in 1839 to about 1945 or 1949, depending on who you ask and why. See, in the 1800s, China was ruled by the last Chinese dynasty, the Qing dynasty, which ruled from 1644 to 1912, prior to being overthrown by the Republic of China. Now, during the early years of the Qing dynasty, China enjoyed a great trade surplus with European powers who sought tea, silk, porcelain, whatever you can think of. Meanwhile, the Chinese demand for European goods was quite low, to be honest. The Chinese would actually only accept payments in silver. Now, simultaneously, at the same time, a number of colonial wars were happening during the 1700s, which made the British economy and honestly a lot of European economies suffer, especially when it came to the production and extraction of silver. The British realized that they could actually balance the trade deficit in their favor by exporting opium, which is a powerful narcotic, into China in exchange for silver and then sell the silver right back to China for their goods. Conveniently, British-controlled India actually already had an existing opium infrastructure, opium farms. They actually decided to, just ramp the current existing farms up. And honestly, I would feel really hard-pressed and bad not telling you about this, but during this time, literally millions of people died because of these opium fields. And yes, I promise I'm gonna tie this all back to America in just a second. See, opium was actually so addictive and so profitable that America actually began selling opium themselves. They purchased opium from Turkey just to cash in on this lucrative trade in China. The opium trade actually created a bit of a crisis, an epidemic in China, and it got so bad to the point where in the 1830s, up to 90% of people living in the coastal regions where this opium was imported were addicted to opium. 90% of people. Naturally, this began to raise somewhat of an existential threat to the Qing dynasty, and following a ban on opium and a number of skirmishes which happened between the Chinese and British due to this tension, the First Opium War began. This Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842, and a number of factors, including literally millennia of isolation in China and a lack of modern technology for warfare, caused a massive and painful defeat for the Chinese. Hence why this is normally known as the start of the century of humiliation. And this event left the country addicted, in poverty, and in complete disarray. Part of the stipulations of the peace treaty they signed with the British basically allowed the British to just flood opium in through the port cities. And this flooding of opium into port cities basically caused an explosion of addiction in China. Now, unlike the British, the Americans actually kept relatively good terms between themselves and China. And a couple years after the war in 1844, they signed the Treaty of Wangjia. I think I pronounced that right. This treaty basically gave America roughly the same privileges, namely trade and the most favored nation status, to the United States that the British conceded from the war. In exchange, the United States decided to give up any American who was trading opium in China. Now, consequently, around the same time, the California gold rush had just begun in 1848, and with it brought substantial Chinese immigration to the United States. And I actually have another video on this topic if you are so interested. I'll leave it up there. These Chinese immigrants were actually initially well received, and they were tremendously productive and helpful in the process of building the first transcontinental railroads in America. However, they were also searching for gold, much like many of the white settlers of California at the time. Gradually, though, the animosity towards the Chinese people grew as gold supplies naturally dwindled, resulting in the Foreign Miners Tax of 1850. This Foreign Miners Tax actually forced people not born in the United States to pay a tax of roughly $20 a month, which, if you don't know, $20 a month back then is roughly equal to about $800 a month today. And this act effectively pushed Chinese migrants out of the mining industry and forced them to find new work in different industries, such as labor work and in restaurants, laundry, and in this case, fishing industries. Now, in the 1850s, China was dealing with a new problem, and a really, really big problem. This was a brutal civil war named the Taiping Rebellion, and this conflict forced even more Chinese citizens to look abroad to find a new home. Most people have never even heard of this war, but it's one of the deadliest wars of all time. And during this conflict, somewhere between 20 to 30 million people died. That's around 5 to 10% of the entire Chinese population. This event caused an even bigger influx of Chinese immigrants, which caused even more animosity in Western states, especially in California. The governor of California, Leland Stanford, in his 1862 inaugural address, meaning the very first speech he gave after he was inaugurated as the governor, had this to say, quote, "The settlement among us of an inferior race," meaning the Chinese, "is to be discouraged." You can't really get much more obvious than that, blatant. While all of this resentment was building up in Northern California, down in Southern California, whaling companies, which were heading from San Francisco to Baja California, actually ended up establishing a small base of operations in the late 1850s on what is now today Ballast Point in San Diego Bay. These fishing companies actually used a very diverse and multi-ethnic labor force consisting of Portuguese, African, Chinese, Irish, and other European American sailors. Across the bay, sometime during the 1860s, a Chinese fishing village actually began to sprout up here in La Playa at this spot. And during its peak, this village had 10 shanty homes, drying racks, salting tanks, and Chinese junkers, which were fishing vessels. The largest junker, the Sun Yun Li, measured 52 feet long and 16 feet across, and even possessed 3 separate masts. The main catches of this fishing village consisted mainly of abalone, which is a type of mollusk delicacy, which actually used to be massively abundant here in the waters, as well as some other fish like white sea bass. At one point during the peak of this village, it supplied a vast majority of all of the seafood in San Diego. Things changed significantly in 1873 when the Army Corps of Engineers actually evicted the whaling and fishing community found on Ballast Point to basically build a military installation. This drove those residents of Ballast Point towards the La Playa community, creating a very diverse and thriving community here in La Playa, despite the other two main large urban centers in San Diego at the time, being Old Town and the New San Diego, being segregated and racially intolerant at the time. During the following decade, the community continued to grow, but as anti-Chinese sentiment spread even more during the same time period, Chinese fishermen began to relocate and move operations down south into Baja California, south of the border. The anti-Chinese sentiment grew substantially in America following the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, where immigration restrictions on Chinese people were actually eased in exchange for better trade deals. The influx of even more Chinese immigrants caused increasing hatred across the country, but especially in Western states. Legislation began becoming drafted up around this time, and the first major act which was drafted to target Chinese people came in 1875, being the Page Act of 1875. This act banned Chinese women from entering the United States, basically to prevent the settling of families in the States. Men, however, were still allowed to travel to the US, mainly for their labor. However, only a short 12 years after that Burlingame Treaty was signed into law, the Engel Treaty of 1880 amended this treaty, which basically allowed the US to suspend Chinese immigration whenever it sees fit for basically whatever reason they want. Lo and behold, only 2 years later, the first ever major US law to prevent immigration from a specific national group was passed. This is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This act originally suspended Chinese immigration for just 10 years, but it was subsequently renewed and strengthened in 1892 and made permanent in 1902. Until the Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act of 1943, meaning that from 1882 to 1943, Chinese immigration to the United States was completely excluded, with some small exceptions. This act was basically the final nail in the coffin for that fishing community in La Playa, which had already begun moving into Baja California due to the rising anti-Chinese hate and sentiment in the States. And by the 1890s, the once thriving fishing and abalone industry in La Playa had to be abandoned entirely. For those Chinese people who actually chose to remain in America, they were essentially demoted to second-class citizens. People already residing in the US prior to the pass of the act were prohibited from becoming citizens, and Chinese people traveling in and out of the country were basically required to carry a certificate identifying their legal status or face deportation. And you know, that sounds awfully familiar, and I just cannot put a finger on why that is, huh? Anywho, in 1888, the Scott Act actually expanded on the Chinese Exclusion Act, preventing Chinese people from re-entering the United States if they leave and go back to China. Workers were essentially faced with a dilemma. Stay where you are hated and provide for your family and never get to see them again, essentially, or return to their home country for good, which was riddled with poverty, war, strife, instability, corruption, everything you can think of. The Geary Act of 1892 extended the Chinese Exclusion Act indefinitely, and even required each Chinese resident to register with a certificate of residence. Without a certificate, he or she would face deportation. Following this Exclusion Act, Chinese and Asians in general were basically subject to violence in what is dubbed the, quote, driving out period in the American West. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, white miners robbed and beat to death an entire community of Chinese miners, claiming the lives of at least 28 people in 1885. No one was ever held accountable or put in jail. In 1887, a gang of horse-mounted thieves killed 34 Chinese miners and stole roughly $5,000 worth of gold at the time. No one was ever held accountable, and the gold was never recovered. Even fishing villages, which tried to persist in spite of the Exclusion Act, were targeted. In 1906, the Chinese fishing community of Point Alones in California was one of the largest in the entire country, and it mysteriously burned down and was reportedly set ablaze by, quote, nefarious individuals, and even water hoses were cut while the community was being looted. And if that didn't piss you off enough, let's talk about some of the justifications brought up for that Chinese Exclusion Act. The first and main point pushed to justify this Chinese Exclusion Act was basically the depreciation of workers' wages and the stealing of jobs. A number of labor unions at the time actually supported the Chinese Exclusion Act, believing industrialists were exploiting Chinese laborers to keep wages low. The main exception to this was the IWW, being the Industrial Workers of the World, openly opposing the act since its foundation in 1905. Now, this point probably had a fair bit of truth to it. We can actually see very similar patterns of this happening today, with industrialists basically exploiting vulnerable people for their cheap labor due to the desperation and non-legal status that they hold in the United States. But I'm telling you, the solution for this is not to put people in an even more desperate and exploitable situation. These people are only doing these awful jobs because your average American does not want to lay railroads, and they don't want to work long, grueling hours for pennies on the dollar, and they didn't really have any other choice. But let's not kid ourselves. This is not really the only reason that the Chinese Exclusion Act passed. It's not like there weren't other immigrants coming into the United States at the time who were also depreciating labor wages and taking jobs. Let's read this passage together. Quote, "The first objection to the Chinese as given by the working men was that the presence of the Chinese reduced the wages of laborers, but increased the profits of the capitalists. However, it is doubtful if the Chinese actually made any perceptible change in the labor market. The fundamental cause for the anti-Chinese sentiment is probably found somewhere in race prejudice." Here are some of the other wonderful justifications for this act, which can be found in the Address to the People of the United States upon the Evils of Chinese Immigration. Now, this report was made by the actual California legislature after they made an entire committee to investigate Chinese immigration in 1876. The, quote, evils are summed up as follows. Number 1, prostitution. Number 2, criminality. Number 3, non-conversion. Number 4, competition. And number 5, coolie slavery. Now, for those who don't know, coolie is a slur or slang for a low-wage immigrant laborer in the US. This phrase mainly refers to Chinese during this time period. This term was actually so ubiquitous that in 1862, Abraham Lincoln passed the Anti-Coolie Act, prohibiting American citizens from transporting Chinese laborers in indentured conditions. Simultaneously, the California state legislature passed, and I'm not shitting you, an act to protect free white labor against the competition with the Chinese coolie labor and discourage the immigration of Chinese into the state of California on April 26, 1862. Now, this act actually passed, and it placed a monthly tax of $2.50, which is roughly $80 a month today, on any Chinese person who was not working in the sugar, rice, coffee, or tea industry. So if they were working in fishing or mining or literally anything else, had to pay $80 a month. So ultimately, what is the whole point of this story? What is the point with all of this? I don't want my country to make the same old racist, xenophobic mistakes of the past again. I don't want to see local communities of hardworking people trying to make a life for themselves get harassed, disrupted, and destroyed just due to the color of their skin. These people are coming from difficult situations which someone born in the US might never be able to comprehend. Worst of all, a lot of people coming into America are actually coming there because of the mess that we made. We directly made the mess, the situation which caused these people to immigrate here. For example, Venezuela. We caused their economy to explode, and now we're mad at the average person who is risking their lives and their families just to come here, just to have a chance to have enough money to feed their families and eat and, America has every right in the world to have borders and have laws which distinguish and determine who is and is not allowed into the country. But the current administration doesn't seem to mind immigration at all when it comes from countries where people look a certain way or fit a certain profile. Meanwhile, there is a huge double standard of actively terrorizing, arresting, and even murdering people who don't fit that same profile in the year 2025. All I gotta say is this: those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I hope you just learned something from this video. I hope you have a wonderful day, and God bless you.